The autumn rain hammered against the windows of the modest two-bedroom apartment on Maple Street, creating a rhythmic percussion that masked the storm brewing inside. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night when everything changed. Sarah Mitchell had just put Emma to bed after reading her favorite bedtime story about a little bunny finding its way home through a dark forest. The irony of that particular story would haunt Sarah for years to come. She'd kissed her 3-year-old daughter on the forehead, tucked the pink blanket with dancing elephants around her small body, and whispered, "Sleep tight, my angel. Mommy's right here." Emma had drifted off quickly, her tiny chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of childhood sleep. Sarah, exhausted from a double shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse, had collapsed onto the living room couch with a cup of chamomile tea, finally allowing herself a moment of quiet. She was reading a novel, an escape she desperately needed from her increasingly volatile marriage, when she heard the key turn in the lock. Her husband David stumbled through the door at 11:55 p.m., bringing with him the unmistakable smell of whiskey and cigarettes. Sarah's body instantly tensed. She'd learned over the past 18 months of their marriage to read the warning signs, the heavy footsteps, the aggressive way he slammed the door, the muttering under his breath. Tonight, all the signals were screaming danger. "Where the hell have you been?" David slurred, his eyes wild and unfocused. His shirt was torn at the collar, and his knuckles bore the marks of a fight. Sarah's stomach twisted with dread. "I've been home," Sarah replied carefully, keeping her voice steady and calm, a technique she'd learned to employ like a shield. "I put Emma to bed an hour ago. She had a good day at she." "I don't care about Emma." David's voice erupted like thunder, cutting through the quiet apartment. He grabbed the ceramic lamp from the side table and hurled it across the room. The crash was deafening as glass exploded against the wall, missing Sarah's head by mere inches. Her heart hammered so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. "I care about the fact that my wife is sitting here reading books like she doesn't have a care in the world while I'm out there busting my ass." Sarah realized with horrifying clarity that this wasn't just another argument. This was different, darker, more dangerous. David's eyes had taken on a crazed, uncontrolled quality she'd never witnessed before. His fists were clenched, and his breathing was ragged and aggressive. Years later, she would wonder if he'd used something more than just alcohol that night. The intensity of his rage seemed to transcend mere drunkenness. "David, please," Sarah whispered, rising slowly from the couch, trying to put distance between them. "Please, let's talk about this. Emma's sleeping. Please, you're scaring me." His response was to grab her wrist with a grip so tight she felt the bones grinding together. Pain shot up her arm like lightning. He twisted her arm behind her back, pushing her toward the kitchen. Sarah's mind immediately shifted into survival mode. She had to protect Emma. That was her only thought. "Emma, Emma, Emma. You think you're better than me?" David screamed directly into her face, his breath reeking of alcohol. "You think you're so smart with your nursing degree and your precious hospital job. You make me feel small. You make me feel worthless." Sarah realized then, with a clarity that would later help her make the decision to leave, that this was about his insecurities, his rage, his broken psyche. None of it was her fault, but understanding that didn't stop the pain. It didn't stop the terror. He threw her against the kitchen counter with such force that the wind was knocked out of her lungs. She crashed into the hard edge and immediately felt something give in her left arm. The agony was white-hot and all-consuming, but worse than the physical pain was the sound that came from down the hallway. Emma's cry, a small, confused, frightened wail from the bedroom. "Mommy, Mommy." The little girl's voice was thin and trembling, the voice of a child waking into a nightmare. Everything inside Sarah screamed to run to her daughter, but David was advancing on her again, his face twisted with rage. "Shut up, Emma. Just shut up." He roared toward the hallway, his violence a living thing that filled every corner of their home. Sarah made a decision in that moment that would shape the rest of her life and her daughter's childhood. She ran, not away from the apartment but toward her daughter's room. David grabbed at her hair, yanking her backward, but she pulled with all her remaining strength, her injured arm screaming in protest. She had to get to Emma. That was all that mattered. Emma stood in her crib, her small face streaked with tears, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. She was confused and terrified, not fully understanding what was happening but old enough to sense the danger. Sarah scooped her daughter up with her good arm, cradling her against her chest, whispering, "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here. Mommy's here." But nothing was okay. David appeared in the doorway, his breathing ragged, his eyes filled with a violence that went beyond mere anger. He reached toward them, and in that moment, Sarah saw the future with terrifying clarity. She had to call for help. She had to do something. With Emma clutched to her chest and her left arm hanging useless at her side, Sarah managed to reach the phone on the nightstand. Her fingers were shaking so badly she could barely dial, but muscle memory took over. 911. The three most important numbers of her life. Police, ambulance, domestic violence, she gasped into the phone, her voice cracking. She gave the dispatcher her address while David stood in the doorway, his rage suddenly transforming into something more dangerous, a cold, calculating awareness of what was happening. For a moment the two of them locked eyes, and Sarah saw the realization dawn on his face. This was over. Their marriage, his freedom, their family, all of it was collapsing in real time. The sirens came within minutes, though they felt like hours to Sarah. She held Emma tightly, whispering promises she desperately hoped she could keep. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. Help is coming. Help is coming." When the police entered, David didn't resist. He sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly deflated as if all the violence had drained out of him, leaving behind only a hollow shell. The paramedics rushed in behind them, immediately assessing Sarah's arm. The fracture was severe, a break in both bones of the forearm. But Sarah barely felt the pain anymore. She was numb, focused entirely on protecting Emma from further trauma. As the police handcuffed David and led him away, he looked at his daughter with an expression that combined regret, rage, and desperation. "Emma, I'm sorry. Daddy's sorry, sweetheart," he called out, but his voice sounded hollow and false. Emma didn't respond. She simply buried her face in her mother's shoulder and held on for dear life. The ambulance transported Sarah to the emergency room while a Child Protective Services officer drove Emma to an emergency foster home. In that car ride, separated from her mother for the first time in her young life, Emma made a choice. She would never speak about this night. She would never speak about anything again. Silence became her shield, and it would lock her away from the world for 3 long years. The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds of Mrs. Small's office at the Department of Child and Family Services, casting long striped shadows across the floor. Emma sat in a child-sized chair positioned across from Mrs.'s desk, her body rigid and motionless as a statue. She was 6 years old now, but something in her posture made her appear much younger, as if the trauma had frozen her in time at age 3, the moment her world had collapsed. 3 years. Exactly 3 years had passed since that terrible night when Emma's father's rage had shattered her family and stolen her voice. Mrs. had been assigned to Emma's case 18 months ago, and in all that time she had never heard the child speak. Not a single word. No whisper. No cry. No laugh. Nothing but an oppressive, suffocating silence that hung around Emma like a heavy fog. Mrs., a social worker with 22 years of experience, had encountered selective mutism before, but never to this degree. She tried every therapeutic approach in her extensive arsenal. In their first session, she'd used play therapy, setting up a dollhouse and encouraging Emma to act out scenarios. Emma had moved the dolls around with mechanical precision, but her face had remained blank, her lips sealed. Mrs. had watched, heartbroken, as the child recreated violent scenes with disturbing accuracy, a small doll representing a father figure slamming another doll representing a mother into the furniture. The clinical documentation of trauma played out in miniature. Art therapy had been equally unsuccessful. Mrs. had provided Emma with every color of marker and crayon imaginable, encouraging her to draw whatever she felt. For 6 months, Emma had produced only blank pages or simple, emotionless sketches. A house, a stick figure, a sun in the corner. Nothing that revealed the inner landscape of her tormented mind. Music therapy, introduced by a specialist from the local university, had also failed. Emma sat through sessions of soft piano music, nature sounds, and gentle singing without any visible response or participation. The worst part for Mrs. was watching Emma's deterioration over those 3 years. The child who had been placed in foster care at age 3, confused, frightened, but still capable of basic communication, had transformed into something else entirely. Emma had become a ghost. She moved through life as if sleepwalking, her eyes vacant and hollow, as if something essential had been extracted from her soul. Her first foster family, the Hendersons, had done their best. They were kind people with good intentions, but they had no experience with severely traumatized children. After 8 months, they'd asked for her to be reassigned. "We don't know how to reach her," Mrs. Henderson had told Mrs., her voice heavy with guilt and resignation. "We're doing everything we can, but she just sits there. It's like she's not even here." Emma's second foster home had been worse. They were overwhelmed with 4 other children and limited patience for a child who required so much emotional scaffolding. Emma had spent most of her time in that home confined to her room, fed mechanically, and essentially warehoused rather than nurtured. Mrs. had documented signs of neglect and had fought hard to have Emma transferred again. Now Emma was living with her third foster family, who were genuinely trying to help, but even they were reaching their limits. The uncertainty was crushing them. Would Emma ever speak again? Would she ever form attachments? Would she ever be able to function in a normal classroom setting? Sarah Mitchell, Emma's biological mother, had been fighting like a warrior throughout this entire ordeal. The night of the attack, she'd emergency surgery to repair the fractures in her arm. The doctors had warned her that she might never regain full mobility in her left hand. But Sarah had refused to accept that limitation. She'd completed physical therapy with fierce determination, pushing through pain that made her want to scream. Her arm still ached on cold mornings, and her hand would never be quite as strong as before, but she'd reclaimed a semblance of her former capacity. The legal battles had been exhausting. Sarah had enrolled in anger management counseling, not because she had anger management issues, but because the court system had mandated it as part of her rehabilitation after the domestic violence incident. She'd attended individual therapy sessions twice a week, diving deep into her own trauma, examining why she'd stayed with David as long as she had, working to understand the warning signs she'd initially missed. She'd completed a course on recognizing domestic violence patterns and understanding trauma's impact on children. She'd rebuilt her career, working night shifts to maintain her nursing position while fighting for custody during the day. Most importantly, Sarah had never given up on her daughter. Mrs. had met with Sarah countless times in this very office. She'd watched the mother's hope rise and fall with each therapy session, each court date, each minor development, or lack thereof, in Emma's condition. Sarah would sit in the hard plastic chair across from Mrs., her eyes red from crying, asking the same desperate questions over and over. Will she ever speak again? Does she remember me? Does she know I'm fighting for her? Mrs. always answered honestly, I don't know. The court system had been cautious, and rightfully so. Emma's trauma was severe. The state's position was that while Sarah seemed to be genuinely rehabilitated, the question remained. Could she adequately care for a child with such profound psychological wounds? Wouldn't Emma be better served by institutional treatment? Wouldn't a specialized facility, staffed with trauma experts and psychiatric professionals, be more appropriate than returning her to a single mother? Sarah's lawyer had argued passionately that Emma's most powerful healing tool was her biological mother, that the bond between mother and child was the foundation upon which all other therapy could be built. The state's lawyer had countered that sentiment was no substitute for professional expertise. The custody hearing was scheduled for next Tuesday, 7 days away. Mrs. had spent the last month preparing her testimony, reviewing all of Emma's records, documenting the progress, or rather, the lack thereof, that the child had made. She would be asked to provide expert opinion on Emma's psychological state and to make a recommendation about her future care. As Mrs. looked at Emma sitting across from her that morning, she felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. This silent, broken child, whose eyes held the kind of pain that shouldn't exist in someone so young, represented everything that was broken about their system. They could place her in foster care indefinitely. They could recommend institutional treatment. They could separate her from her mother indefinitely. Or they could take a risk. They could believe that love, combined with professional support, might be enough. They could give Sarah and Emma the chance to heal together. Mrs. reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a thin folder. Inside were photos of Emma from before that terrible night, a laughing 3-year-old with curly brown hair and bright, intelligent eyes. Emma was playing with blocks in her mother's arms. Emma was blowing out candles on a birthday cake. Emma was alive in a way she no longer was. Mrs. looked up from those photos and made a decision that would change everything. There had to be something more they could try. There had to be a way to reach this child before Tuesday's hearing. Something unconventional, something bold, something that the traditional therapeutic system hadn't offered. Mrs. began researching late into the night, desperate to find any tool, any approach, any possibility that might unlock the fortress Emma had built around her shattered heart. She didn't know what she was looking for yet, but she knew with absolute certainty that she had to find it before the custody hearing determined Emma's fate forever. The fluorescent lights of Mrs. Home office hummed their monotonous tune as she sat hunched over her laptop at 2:47 a.m., her third cup of cold coffee growing a film of congealed cream on its surface. She'd been researching for 6 hours straight, her eyes burning with fatigue, her mind racing with a frenetic energy born of desperation. Outside her window, the neighborhood was silent except for the occasional car passing by on the wet street. It had rained earlier, and the air smelled of wet earth and possibility. Mrs. had sent Sarah a text message just before midnight. "Don't give up. I'm working on something." She hadn't meant to give false hope, but she couldn't help herself. After 22 years in this profession, after hundreds of cases, after witnessing the best and worst of humanity's capacity to love and harm children, she recognized when a situation demanded something beyond protocol. Emma's case was that situation. The traditional approaches had failed. The system, for all its good intentions, was about to institutionalize a 6-year-old girl who belonged with her mother. Her search had started with simple keywords: trauma therapy, selective mutism treatment, breakthrough therapeutic techniques. But the results had been disappointing, mostly academic papers confirming what she already knew. Traditional talk therapy rarely worked with children as severely traumatized as Emma. Medication could manage symptoms but couldn't heal the underlying wound. Art and music therapy required a baseline level of emotional engagement that Emma simply didn't possess. Then, around 1:15 a.m., Mrs. had stumbled onto an article in a peer-reviewed psychology journal titled Equine-Assisted Therapy and Trauma Recovery in Children. She'd read about horses working with traumatized children, helping them process emotions and rebuild trust through nonverbal communication. The article cited remarkable recovery rates and included case studies that made her heart race. If horses could do this, what about other animals? Her search had become more targeted. Animal-assisted therapy, dogs and trauma, canine therapy protocols. What she discovered was revolutionary. Dogs weren't just emotional support animals. Certain breeds, specifically trained by professionals, could function as genuine therapeutic partners for children with severe psychological wounds. They could sense emotional distress without requiring verbal communication. They could provide unconditional acceptance that bypassed all the psychological defenses a traumatized child had constructed. Most importantly, they could create a bridge, a safe, nonverbal pathway toward communication that traditional therapy couldn't access. Mrs. Hand's trembled as she clicked through testimonials from parents whose children had responded to animal-assisted therapy. Stories of children who hadn't spoken in years suddenly whispering words to a dog. Stories of selective mutism breaking through gentle animal interaction. Stories that seemed almost too good to be true, yet were documented by licensed therapists and by medical professionals. She found K9 Comfort's website at 3:02 a.m. The organization operated throughout the state, pairing specially trained police dogs with children in crisis situations. The dogs weren't aggressive or intimidating. They were selected specifically for their gentle temperaments and their intuitive ability to sense and respond to human emotion. The training process was rigorous, taking 18-24 months per dog handler team. The results, according to their case studies, were nothing short of miraculous. Mrs. scrolled through the K9 Comfort team profiles until she found him, Officer and his partner, Bailey, a 4-year-old golden retriever. The bio described Officer as a 20-year veteran of the police force who had transitioned into K9 therapy work after witnessing the profound impact animals could have on traumatized communities. Bailey was described as exceptionally intuitive, with a proven track record of reaching children who had completely withdrawn from traditional therapeutic settings. There was a video embedded in Bailey's profile. Mrs. clicked play. The footage showed Bailey working with a 7-year-old boy who hadn't spoken since witnessing his older brother's death. The child sat rigidly on the floor, his arms wrapped around his knees, his face completely expressionless. Officer brought Bailey into the room and simply sat beside the dog, not forcing interaction, just being present. Bailey, with an almost supernatural awareness, approached the boy slowly, her tail wagging gently. The dog rested her head against the boy's leg and waited. 5 minutes passed in the video, nothing happened. Then the boy's hand descended slowly, trembling, and touched Bailey's fur. Officer spoke softly, "She likes you. Her name is Bailey. She came here to be your friend." The boy continued petting the dog for another 10 minutes. Then, so quietly it was barely audible, he whispered, "Soft, good girl." Mrs. watched as tears streamed down the boy's face, not tears of sadness but of release. Something had broken open inside him. Something fundamental had shifted. She paused the video and sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. This was what Emma needed. Mrs. looked at her phone. It was 3:47 a.m., completely unreasonable to call anyone at this hour. But she couldn't wait. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't go through another day knowing she hadn't pursued this with everything she had. She typed out an email to Officer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Dear Officer, I am a social worker with the Department of Child and Family Services. I am writing to you regarding a 6-year-old girl named Emma who has been unable to speak for 3 years due to severe trauma from domestic violence. All conventional therapeutic interventions have been unsuccessful. I've watched your video of Bailey's work with another traumatized child, and I believe Emma might respond to animal-assisted therapy in a way she hasn't responded to anything else. We have a custody hearing scheduled for next Tuesday. I know this is an enormous ask and extremely short notice, but I'm desperate to give this child one more chance before the legal system warehouses her in an institutional setting away from her mother. Is there any possibility that you and Bailey might be available to work with Emma before Tuesday? I understand if this isn't possible. I'm reaching out because I've exhausted every conventional option, and your work represents the only unconventional approach I believe might actually reach her. Please advise. Sincerely, Mrs. Department of Child and Family Services." She hit send at 3:52 a.m. and immediately felt foolish. Officer would probably be sleeping. He would see this email in the morning and delete it. She was a stranger, a social worker, not even a direct referral through official K9 Comfort channels. Why would he respond to her desperate plea? Mrs. was about to close her laptop when her phone buzzed. She checked it, confused. An email notification at this hour. She opened it. It was from Officer. The timestamp showed 3:54 a.m. Mrs. I'm a light sleeper and work night shifts. I just read your email. Emma's story touches my heart. I've spent 15 years working patrol, and I've seen the devastating impact domestic violence has on families. I've also seen Bailey work miracles. Bring Emma to my station tomorrow at 2 p.m. I can't make any promises, but I can offer Bailey's presence and let whatever happens happen. Sometimes these children respond. Sometimes they need multiple sessions. But I've learned never to underestimate the power of a dog's unconditional love. See you tomorrow. Officer. K9 Comfort Program. Mrs. read the email 4 times, each time feeling the weight of possibility settle into her chest. She immediately called Sarah, not caring that it was almost 4 a.m. Sarah answered on the first ring. What's wrong? Is Emma okay? The fear in her voice was palpable. Emma's fine, Mrs. said quickly. I'm calling because I found something, a program, K9 Comfort. They work with police dogs trained specifically to help traumatized children. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. I'm bringing Emma to meet with Officer and his dog, Bailey. I can't explain right now, but Sarah, I have a feeling about this. I have a really good feeling. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. You're not supposed to give me false hope, she whispered, but I'm going to hold on to it anyway. Mrs. disconnected the call and returned to her laptop. She pulled up Bailey's video again, watching the moment the boy whispered those first words in years. Soft, good girl. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow maybe, just maybe, Emma would find her voice again. The sun was rising over the city as Mrs. finally closed her laptop and allowed herself to rest, her heart full of fragile, desperate hope. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the courthouse as Mrs. sat in her car in the parking lot, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Beside her, in the back seat, Emma stared out the window with her characteristic blankness. She was dressed in a pink sundress that Mrs. had carefully selected, something cheerful, something that might signal to the girl that today was different from other days. Emma hadn't asked any questions about where they were going. She never asked questions anymore. Mrs. phone buzzed, a text from Officer, we're inside. Ready whenever you are, remember no pressure, just let it happen naturally. Mrs. took a deep breath, unbuckled her, and opened the back door. Come on, Emma. We're going to meet someone special today. Emma slid out of the car seat with mechanical obedience. She took Mrs.'s hand, not with enthusiasm or curiosity, but with the passive compliance that characterized all her movements. They walked toward the courthouse entrance together, Emma's small hand barely registering in Mrs.'s grip. The building was imposing, with its gray stone columns and austere architecture. Mrs. had arranged with Judge Harrison to use a small chambers room rather than the formal courtroom for this initial interaction. It was more intimate, less intimidating, though nothing could truly prepare a traumatized child for what was about to happen. They climbed the marble stairs. Emma's small feet made soft sounds against the hard surface. Mrs. kept talking softly, her voice a steady stream of reassurance. We're going to meet a nice man and a very special dog. The dog's name is Bailey. She's very soft and very kind. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. We're just going to visit. Emma said nothing. She never did. When they entered the chambers, the first thing Mrs. noticed was Officer. He was a tall man in his mid-50s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had spent decades carrying the weight of other people's pain. He wore his police uniform, but his posture was relaxed, non-threatening. He wasn't here as an authority figure. He was here as a facilitator of something far more important than law and order. But it was Bailey who immediately captured Mrs.'s attention. The golden retriever was even more beautiful in person than in photographs. Her coat gleamed like burnished gold under the fluorescent lights, and her eyes held an almost supernatural intelligence. She lay on a plush dog bed positioned in the center of the room, her head resting on her paws, completely calm and centered. When she noticed Mrs. and Emma entering, her tail wagged, not frantically, but with measured, purposeful movements that suggested she understood the gravity of the moment. "Hello," Officer said quietly, extending his hand to Mrs. His grip was firm but gentle. "Thank you for bringing Emma. Bailey's been looking forward to this." He said it with complete sincerity, as if the dog had literally expressed this sentiment. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, her small frame rigid with the tension that had become her default state. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the unfamiliar space, the man in uniform, and then, finally, the dog. Mrs. watched as Emma's gaze locked onto Bailey. For the first time in 3 years, Mrs. saw something shift in the girl's expression. Not much. Just the tiniest flicker of something that might have been curiosity. "Why don't we sit down?" Officer suggested, gesturing to 2 small chairs positioned several feet away from Bailey's bed. "Bailey likes to go at her own pace. We don't push. We just be present with her and she decides what happens next." Mrs. gently guided Emma to one of the chairs. The girl sat down stiffly, her legs not quite reaching the floor, her hands folded in her lap. Mrs. took the chair beside her, creating a united front of calm, non-threatening presence. Officer took his position on the floor near Bailey, but not so close as to seem controlling or restrictive. "Bailey is a very special dog," he said in a soft, conversational tone. "She's been trained to help children who have had difficult experiences. She knows things without being told. She understands feelings without words. That's one of the things that makes her so extraordinary." Emma's eyes remained fixed on Bailey. The dog hadn't moved, hadn't approached. She simply lay on her bed, completely still except for her gently wagging tail, her intelligent eyes tracking Emma's gaze. Minutes passed, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Nothing happened, and yet everything was happening. Mrs. could feel the tension in Emma's body beginning to shift ever so slightly. The girl's shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears, dropped a fraction of an inch. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, began to slow. "Bailey came into my life 7 years ago," Officer continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was working patrol and I had seen a lot of hard things, a lot of violence, a lot of sadness, and I was tired, really tired. Then Bailey came along and she taught me something important. She taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is just be present, not fixing, not talking, just being here with someone who's hurting." Emma's right hand uncurled from her lap, just slightly, just a millimeter of openness in a body that had been clenched shut for 3 years. "Sometimes," Officer said, "people have had experiences that are so big, so scary, that words aren't enough to express them. Words can feel dangerous. Words can feel like they might make things worse. So people stop using words. And that's okay. That's a choice the body makes to protect itself." Mrs. felt tears prickling at her eyes. Officer understood. He understood that Emma's silence wasn't stubbornness or defiance or an inability to communicate. It was a survival mechanism. It was her body's brilliant, terrible attempt to protect itself from further harm. Bailey suddenly stood up, not suddenly in an aggressive way, but with purpose. She stepped down from her bed and began walking toward Emma with slow, deliberate movements. There was no rush, no enthusiasm, no demand, just a gentle, purposeful approach. Emma's entire body went rigid. This was it. This was the moment where it could go either way, toward connection or toward deeper withdrawal. Bailey approached until she was just a few feet from Emma's chair. Then she lay down on the floor, her body positioned so that her head was level with Emma's dangling feet. She didn't touch the girl. She didn't demand attention. She simply positioned herself in that space between physical contact and distance, available but not imposing. For several long seconds, nothing moved. Then Emma's hand descended from her lap. It shook as it moved downward, trembling with the weight of the moment. Her small fingers extended toward Bailey's coat. When Emma's fingers made contact with Bailey's fur, Mrs. literally felt her breath catch in her throat. Officer's eyes closed briefly, as if he was experiencing the moment with every fiber of his being. Bailey's tail wagged, not frantically, not in celebration, just a gentle acknowledgement that contact had been made, that connection was happening. "She likes you," Officer said softly. "Bailey knows you've had a difficult time, she knows you're scared, and she wants you to know something very important, Emma. You're safe here, you're safe with Bailey." Emma's fingers continued to stroke the dog's golden fur, her touch becoming slightly less tremulous. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, began to deepen. For the first time in 3 years, something shifted in the girl's expression, a tiny crack in the fortress, a microscopic opening in the wall. Mrs. reached over and gently placed her hand on Emma's shoulder. She said nothing. Words weren't needed. This moment existed beyond language, in that sacred space where one suffering being reaches out to another and discovers that they are not alone. Bailey rested her head closer to Emma's leg, her eyes half closed in that peaceful, accepting expression that dogs seem to possess. In that moment, 3 souls, a traumatized child, a trained therapeutic dog, and a social worker who had refused to give up, occupied the same sacred space where healing begins. The silence in the chambers seemed to expand, to fill every corner of the room with a presence that was almost tangible. Emma's small fingers continued their gentle exploration of Bailey's golden fur, her touch becoming incrementally less tremulous with each passing second. Her breathing had shifted from the shallow, rapid gasps that characterized her anxiety into something deeper, more rhythmic, almost meditative. Mrs. held her own breath, terrified that any sudden movement or sound might shatter this fragile moment of connection. Minutes stretched and contracted like living things. Officer remained perfectly still, his presence a steady anchor in the room. Even his breathing seemed deliberately measured, intentional, designed to model the calm that Bailey was projecting. The dog's tail continued its gentle, rhythmic movement against the plush bed, not wagging with excitement but thumping softly, a metronome of acceptance. Emma's other hand slowly uncurled from her lap. Both of her small hands were now engaged in stroking Bailey's coat, her fingers moving with increasing confidence. She traced the contours of the dog's shoulders, her ribs, the slope of her back. It was as if she was learning Bailey through touch, memorizing the texture, the warmth, the reality of another living being's unconditional presence. Mrs. watched Emma's face with the intensity of a hawk. After 3 years of complete emotional flatness, she was witnessing the first signs of genuine affect. Emma's jaw, which had been clenched tight, had relaxed. The vertical tension lines that had become permanent fixtures between her eyebrows had softened. Most significantly, her eyes, those hollow, vacant eyes that had haunted Mrs.'s nightmares, were beginning to shine with something that looked disturbingly like life. Bailey shifted her body slightly, repositioning herself so that her head rested more comfortably against Emma's leg. It was a gesture of extraordinary significance. The dog was no longer just tolerating contact. She was actively engaging, creating an intimate physical space that transcended the boundaries between human and animal, victim and healer. Then something remarkable happened. A sound emerged from Emma's throat. Not words, not yet, just a sound, a soft exhalation that seemed to carry months, years of pent-up emotion. It was almost a whimper, but not one of pain. It was the sound of something beginning to break open, something long frozen beginning to thaw. Officer's eyes closed for a moment, and Mrs. noticed his chest rise and fall with deliberate, intentional breathing. He was giving the moment space. He was respecting whatever was occurring on the other side of Emma's fortress walls. Emma continued stroking Bailey, and her breathing became more pronounced. Her shoulders began to move with each breath, small, subtle movements that suggested her entire body was participating in this encounter. And then, so quietly it was barely audible, so tentatively that Mrs. had to lean forward to catch it, a word emerged. Soft. One word, 3 letters, a whisper barely distinguishable from the ambient sound of the courthouse. But in that moment, it was the most powerful syllable that had ever been spoken in that room. Mrs. felt her throat constrict. Tears that she'd been suppressing for 3 years suddenly demanded release. Beside her, Officer opened his eyes, and she could see the moisture glistening in them. Yes, Officer said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Bailey is very soft. She's soft on the outside, but she's also soft on the inside. She has a soft heart. Emma continued stroking the dog's fur, and her small voice, rusty from disuse, fragile as spring ice, spoke again. This time the words came slightly louder with marginally more confidence. Good girl. 2 words. The same 2 words that had transformed another traumatized child in Officer's previous case. But to Emma, these weren't just words. They were keys. They were proof that her voice still existed, that it hadn't been permanently stolen by the trauma. They were evidence that she was still human, still capable of connection, still alive. Bailey's tail thumped against the bed with increased frequency. The dog seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted. Her eyes focused intently on Emma, and she made a soft, almost inaudible whining sound, not a whine of distress, but a whine of recognition. Animal to human, soul to soul. Emma's hands stilled on Bailey's fur. Her eyes widened, and Mrs. could see the girl processing the reality of what had just happened. She had spoken. She had broken 3 years of silence, and the world had not fallen apart. The room had not collapsed. Her mother had not appeared in the doorway with accusations or anger. Instead, there was only safety, only acceptance, only a dog who loved her unconditionally. What's her name? Emma asked, her voice slightly stronger now, emboldened by the first successful utterance. The question was directed not at Officer but at Bailey herself, as if the dog might answer. Her name is Bailey, Officer said gently, and I think she really likes you, Emma. I think she came here specifically to meet you today. Emma repeated the name slowly, testing it on her tongue. Bailey, Bailey, Bailey. Each repetition seemed to ground her further in this moment, this reality where she had a voice and could use it, where she could name things and ask questions and participate in the world. Does she have a home? Emma asked, her words coming with increasing fluidity, as if the dam that had held back her voice was now cracking open with genuine fractures. Does someone love her? Can she stay with me? The questions tumbled out with an urgency that suggested Emma wasn't just asking about Bailey. She was asking about herself. Does anyone love me? Can I stay somewhere? Is there a place where I belong? Officer leaned forward, his eyes glistening openly now, tears streaming down his weathered face. Bailey lives with me, he said softly. She has a home, and yes, someone very much loves her. I love Bailey with all my heart. And I think she might love you too, Emma. In that moment, Judge Harrison, who had been observing from behind a partially closed door at the back of the chambers, something Mrs. had arranged with his permission, stepped forward. The stern, austere judge who had presided over countless custody cases, who had built a reputation on objectivity and legal precision, was visibly shaken. His hands trembled as he reached into his pocket for a tissue. Emma looked up at the judge, seemingly unconcerned by his presence. She had crossed some invisible threshold where the presence of authority figures no longer triggered her defensive mechanisms. She had discovered something far more powerful than fear. She had discovered that she could communicate, that her voice mattered, that connection was possible. Can Bailey come to the hearing? Emma asked, looking from Officer to Judge Harrison to Mrs. I want Bailey there. Bailey makes me feel safe. Mrs. nodded, unable to speak, her throat completely closed with emotion. Officer smiled through his tears, and Judge Harrison, stern, objective Judge Harrison, found himself unable to maintain his judicial composure. He excused himself from the room, knowing that what had just transpired transcended the boundaries of his courtroom and entered the realm of human miracle. Mrs. pulled Emma into her arms for the first time in 3 years, and the girl, who had been locked inside her own mind, imprisoned by trauma, allowed herself to be held, and held Bailey's leash, which Officer gently placed in her small hand. 3 years of silence had been broken by 2 words and the unconditional love of a golden retriever who understood what all the therapy in the world could not achieve. Sometimes healing requires not words or expertise or authority, but simply the presence of a being who sees you and loves you anyway. The chambers seemed to transform into a different space entirely. What had been a formal, sterile legal room now felt warm and alive with possibility. Emma sat on the floor beside Bailey, her small body no longer rigid but flowing with natural movement. She petted the dog's golden coat with increasing confidence, her questions coming faster now, her voice growing stronger with each utterance. "How old is Bailey?" Emma asked, her eyes bright with genuine curiosity for the first time in 3 years. "Does she like to play? What's her favorite thing in the whole world?" Officer settled himself cross-legged on the floor beside them, maintaining his calm presence but now engaging more actively in conversation with Emma. "Bailey is 4 years old," he said, his voice warm and measured. "She loves to play fetch, and she loves swimming in the lake near my house, but I think her favorite thing in the whole world is helping children like you." Emma absorbed this information with the hunger of someone who had been starved of normal social interaction. "Does she get scared?" she asked, and Mrs. recognized the question for what it truly was. Emma asking if it was okay to be scared, if even strong, capable creatures like Bailey experienced fear. "Sometimes," Officer admitted. "Everybody gets scared sometimes, even dogs, even police officers, even people who seem really strong on the outside. Being scared is part of being alive. It's what we do with the scared feeling that matters." Emma nodded solemnly, processing this wisdom. She continued petting Bailey, and her breathing had become completely synchronized with the dog's, a natural rhythm that suggested their nervous systems were literally harmonizing. Mrs. recognized this as the neurobiological foundation of healing. When a traumatized child's nervous system could synchronize with a calm, regulated presence, the brain could begin to recalibrate what safety looked like. "Can I ask Bailey a question?" Emma said, her voice taking on a wonder-struck quality that made Mrs. Hart ache with the beauty of it. "Of course," Officer said. "What would you like to ask her?" Emma leaned close to Bailey's ear and whispered something so quietly that no one else in the room could hear. Bailey's tail thumped against the floor, and the dog turned her head to lick Emma's small hand. Emma giggled, a sound so pure, so innocent, so completely absent from her life for 3 years that everyone in the room felt it like a physical force. Judge Harrison, who had retreated to observe from a distance, found himself gripping the edge of a desk to steady himself. He had presided over family law for 3 decades. He had seen countless custody battles, witnessed the worst of human nature expressed through legal arguments and courtroom drama. But he had never, not once, witnessed a transformation this profound. "What did you ask her?" Mrs. asked gently, though she already suspected the answer. Emma looked up, her eyes glistening with tears that were now clearly tears of relief rather than pain. "I asked her if she thought my mommy loved me," Emma said quietly. "Even though Daddy hurt Mommy, I asked if Mommy still loves me even though I got taken away." The room fell completely silent. Mrs. felt her own tears overflow, streaming down her face without restraint. Officer's jaw clenched as he fought to maintain his composure. "What did Bailey say?" Mrs. asked, though she thought she knew. "Bailey says," Emma began, and then her voice broke, actually broke, with emotion, "that my mommy loves me so much that it's bigger than anything bad that ever happened. Bailey says my mommy has been fighting and fighting to get me back because that's what mommies do when they love their bobbies." Emma collapsed against Bailey's side, and the dog immediately adjusted her position to provide maximum comfort and support. Bailey's body cradled Emma's small frame, and the girl sobbed, not the silent, contained sobs she had likely experienced in private during her 3 years of isolation, but full, body-racking, cathartic sobs that released years of accumulated grief and fear and confusion. Officer moved to the tissue box and brought it back, placing it within reach without making any move to interrupt Emma's emotional release. He understood that this crying was necessary, that it was part of the healing process, that tears were the body's way of processing trauma that words couldn't quite reach. "Where is my mommy?" Emma asked between sobs. "Can I see my mommy? I want to tell her I love her. I want to tell her I remember her. I want to." Her voice dissolved into another wave of tears. Mrs. looked at Officer, and a silent agreement passed between them. Judge Harrison emerged from his position of observation and approached Emma carefully, making sure his movement was slow and non-threatening. The girl looked up at him, this authority figure in black robes, and instead of fear, she saw in his expression the same compassion that Bailey projected. "Your mother is in this building," Judge Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's been waiting to see you. She's been waiting for a very long time, and I think it's time you saw her." Emma's eyes widened. "Right now? Can I see her right now?" "In just a moment," Officer said. "But first, I want you to know something very important, Emma. Bailey is going to stay with you from now on. Well, not stay with you all the time because I need her to help other children too, but she's going to be part of your life. She's going to be your friend. And whenever you need to feel safe, whenever you feel scared, you can think about Bailey. You can think about her soft fur and her gentle eyes and remember that you are loved." Emma looked down at Bailey, and the dog's intelligent eyes met hers. Something passed between them, a recognition, an agreement, a bond that transcended species and language and the normal boundaries of human connection. "Okay," Emma whispered, "I'm ready. I want to see my mommy." Mrs. took Emma's hand, and Officer held open the door. As they walked into the hallway, Emma kept looking back at Bailey, drawing strength from the dog's calm presence. The courthouse hallway suddenly felt less institutional and more like a bridge, a passage between the old Emma, the silent Emma, the broken Emma, and the new Emma who was beginning to emerge. Sarah Mitchell was waiting in the adjacent room, having been called by Mrs. just moments before. She stood as the door opened, and when she saw her daughter, her beautiful, traumatized, miraculously speaking daughter, emerging into the hallway, she let out a cry that came from somewhere deep in her soul. "Emma," Sarah rushed toward her daughter, then stopped, suddenly uncertain. Would Emma want to be held? Had she changed so much in 3 years that her own mother was a stranger? But Emma ran toward her mother, her small legs pumping with a determination that suggested she'd been waiting for this reunion since the moment they'd been torn apart. "Mommy! Mommy! Mommy!" she cried, the word tumbling from her lips over and over, each repetition a prayer, a promise, a reclamation of the bond that trauma had tried to sever. Sarah caught her daughter and held her with an intensity that suggested she might never let go again. And she didn't, not for a long time. She simply held Emma and cried and whispered apologies and affirmations and love into her daughter's hair. Judge Harrison watched from a distance, tears streaming down his face, and he made a silent vow to himself. Whatever obstacles the legal system presented, whatever arguments the state's attorneys made, whatever protocols dictated, he would find a way to keep this mother and daughter together. He had just witnessed a miracle, and no amount of legal precedent or bureaucratic procedure would stand in its way. Behind them, visible through the open doorway, Bailey rested her head on her paws and watched with those ancient, knowing eyes. The eyes of a creature who understood that sometimes healing requires not law or medicine or therapy, but simply the presence of unconditional love and the courage of a child to speak her truth into the world. The formal courtroom felt transformed, though nothing physical had changed. Same heavy oak benches, the same imposing judge's bench, The same institutional architecture that had intimidated countless families now seemed to glow with something approaching redemption. Sarah Mitchell sat at the plaintiff's table beside her attorney, but her attention was entirely focused on her daughter, who sat beside Mrs. in the gallery. Emma held a small stuffed animal, a golden retriever that officer had provided, clutching it against her chest as if it contained all the security and love in the world. Judge Harrison entered from his chambers and the bailiff called the court to order, but before proceeding with the formal hearing, the judge made an extraordinary decision. He requested that the courtroom be cleared except for essential parties. The state's attorneys, the family's attorneys, Mrs., Officer, Emma, and Sarah remained. The judge wanted no media circus, no public spectacle. What was about to transpire was sacred ground. "Before we proceed with testimony," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying a weight and authority that commanded absolute attention, "I want to address what occurred in my chambers approximately 1 hour ago. I witnessed something today that transcends the normal boundaries of legal procedure. I witnessed a miracle of human resilience and the transformative power of unconditional love." He looked directly at Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, your fight to reclaim custody of your daughter has been documented in this file. Months of therapy, anger management classes, professional rehabilitation, rebuilding your life from ashes. The court acknowledges your efforts and your dedication." Then he turned to Emma. "And Emma, what you did today, finding your voice after 3 years of silence, choosing to speak, choosing to trust again, that took more courage than most adults will ever possess in their entire lives." Emma's small hand gripped her stuffed Bailey, her eyes wide as she listened to the judge speak to her directly. She still didn't fully understand the legal proceedings, but she understood tone. She understood that Judge Harrison was not someone to fear. The state's attorney stood to present their case, but there was a palpable shift in the courtroom energy. They argued, as they had argued in preliminary hearings, that Emma required specialized institutional care, that a single mother, however rehabilitated, might not have the resources to address such profound trauma. They spoke in measured, professional tones about protocols and expertise and best practices. But their words fell into a void. Judge Harrison listened with an expression that suggested he was hearing them from very far away. Sarah's attorney stood and presented the counterargument with passion that bordered on poetry. She spoke about the unbreakable bond between mother and child, about Sarah's willingness to do whatever necessary to support her daughter's healing, about the evidence that Emma herself had provided. Her first words in 3 years had been given in response to the possibility of reunion with her mother. "Your Honor," Sarah's attorney concluded, "the state's argument assumes that professional distance and institutional expertise are superior to maternal love and dedication. But what we witnessed today proves otherwise. Emma found her voice not through institutional protocol, but through the unconditional love of an animal and the desperate hope that she might see her mother again. The greatest therapeutic resource available to this child is not a facility or a staff of experts. It is the woman who has fought every single day to reclaim her daughter, Sarah Mitchell." Judge Harrison sat silently for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the force of absolute conviction. "This court has reviewed the evidence," he began. "The plaintiff's rehabilitation efforts have been exemplary. The defendant's, the child's, response to therapeutic intervention has been extraordinary. But most importantly, this court has had the privilege of witnessing something that no amount of legal precedent or psychological expertise could fully capture. The moment a child chooses to speak, chooses to trust, and chooses to reach toward her mother." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the courtroom. "It is the ruling of this court that full custody of Emma Mitchell be returned to her biological mother, Sarah Mitchell, effective immediately. Supervised visitation with officer and the K-9 Comfort Program shall continue on a voluntary basis, as both parties have expressed their desire to maintain this therapeutic relationship. Mandatory counseling for the child will continue, and Sarah Mitchell shall maintain her current employment and living situation. Furthermore, this court orders that quarterly check-ins occur to monitor Emma's progress and adjustment. He banged his gavel, and the sound echoed through the courtroom like a bell proclaiming salvation. Additionally, Judge Harrison continued, his voice taking on an almost mystical quality, I want to formally commend Officer and the K-9 Comfort Program. What you have accomplished today demonstrates innovation and compassion that goes far beyond the call of duty. You have reminded this court why we exist, not to punish or separate, but to protect and heal when possible. Sarah rose from her chair so suddenly that she knocked it backward. She moved toward Emma, her face transformed by joy and relief so profound that she appeared years younger. Emma ran toward her mother, her small legs moving with desperate speed, her stuffed Bailey held high like a trophy. When they collided, Sarah fell to her knees and gathered her daughter into her arms. Emma's voice, that precious, hard-won voice, poured out, Mommy, Mommy, I can come home with you. Bailey said you love me. Bailey was right. Bailey said you've been fighting for me. Bailey said. Sarah couldn't speak. She could only hold her daughter and cry, tears of joy, tears of relief, tears of vindication. All the nights she'd lain awake wondering if she would ever see her daughter again. All the therapy sessions where she'd confronted her own guilt and shame. All the court appearances where she'd had to prove her worth as a mother. All of it had led to this moment. Judge Harrison watched, making no attempt to hide his own tears. This was what justice looked like. Not punishment or legal maneuvering, but the restoration of what had been broken. The reunification of what had been torn apart. Mrs. embraced both Sarah and Emma. An officer placed his hand on Judge Harrison's shoulder. The judge turned to him and simply nodded, a gesture of profound understanding passing between two men who had just witnessed something beyond the ordinary. Emma pulled back from her mother and looked up at her face with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every detail. Mommy, can Bailey come to our home? Officer said Bailey helps children. Can she help me at home? Sarah looked at Officer, her expression asking the question her voice couldn't quite form. Bailey and I will visit twice a week, Officer said, and Emma can visit me and Bailey anytime she wants. This bond they've formed, it's going to be part of her healing process. But more importantly, Emma, your mommy is going to be part of your healing too. Your mommy is the most important person in your recovery. Remember that. Emma nodded solemnly and turned back to her mother. Let's go home, Mommy. Let's go home. Sarah stood, lifting her daughter into her arms and walked toward the courtroom exit. As they passed Officer, Emma reached out and touched Bailey's head gently. The dog's tail wagged in that measured, knowing way that suggested she understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. Judge Harrison watched them leave, and he made a note in Emma's file. This case represents the triumph of human resilience, maternal love, and the unexpected power of compassion. May all our decisions be guided by this moment when we chose healing over bureaucracy, connection over procedure. The courtroom emptied, and in the hallway, Sarah Mitchell and her daughter Emma walked toward their new beginning, a beginning that had been forged not through legal argumentation, but through the miracle of a dog's unconditional love and a child's courage to speak her truth. 6 months had passed since that extraordinary day in Judge Harrison's chambers when Emma had spoken her first words in 3 years. The modest 3-bedroom house on Elm Street had been transformed into something more than just a residence. It had become a sanctuary of healing and hope. The walls were painted in soft pastels, decorated with Emma's artwork from school, photographs of Sarah and Emma together, and a special framed picture of Emma and Bailey that hung in the living room like a sacred icon. Emma sat at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, her small hands gripping a pencil with concentration as she worked on her spelling homework. She was now in 1st grade, a transition that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. Her teacher, Mrs., had been initially skeptical about Emma's capacity to engage in a traditional classroom environment, But the girl had surprised everyone. "Mommy, is Bailey coming today?" Emma asked, her voice filled with the natural enthusiasm of childhood, a sound that had once seemed impossible. "Officer said they'd be here around 2 o'clock, Sarah replied, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. She was preparing lunch, something she'd learned to do without pain in her left arm, though it would never be quite as strong as before. "You know what day it is today?" Emma's face scrunched in concentration. "Thursday." "It's Bailey's 4-year-old birthday," Sarah said. "Officer mentioned it last week. We're going to bake her a special dog treat for dessert." Emma squealed with delight and immediately abandoned her spelling homework in favor of this more exciting prospect. Sarah watched her daughter with a heart so full it seemed it might overflow. 6 months ago, she would have despaired at the homework interruption. Now, she celebrated Emma's capacity for joy, for spontaneity, for being a normal, slightly chaotic child. The kitchen filled with the aroma of peanut butter and pumpkin as they prepared Bailey's birthday treats. Sarah found herself crying softly as she watched her daughter work, not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude for second chances and miracles that came in unexpected forms. Since the custody hearing, Emma's progress had been extraordinary. The selective mutism had not completely vanished overnight, but it had transformed dramatically. Emma now spoke regularly, at home, at school, in therapy sessions. There were still moments of withdrawal, still nights when she woke screaming from nightmares about that terrible evening when her father's violence had shattered her world. But increasingly, these moments were becoming the exception rather than the rule. Sarah had enrolled Emma in trauma-informed therapy with a psychologist who specialized in childhood PTSD. Twice a week, Emma would sit in Dr. Swarm, inviting office and process her trauma in age-appropriate ways. But Sarah had noticed that the most significant healing seemed to occur on the days when Bailey visited. Officer arrived at 1:55 p.m., 10 minutes early as always. Bailey bounded through the door, not frantically or aggressively, but with that same purposeful gentleness that had first captured Emma's heart. The dog had become a fixture in their home. She knew the layout of the house, knew which chair in the living room was her favorite, knew that Thursdays meant special treats and Emma's undivided attention. Emma launched herself at Bailey, and the dog responded by allowing the girl to wrap her arms around her neck. But what struck Sarah most profoundly was the reciprocity of the relationship. Bailey actively sought Emma out. When Officer and Bailey arrived, Bailey's first movement was always toward Emma, regardless of who else was in the room. "Look what we made for your birthday, Bailey," Emma exclaimed, holding up the plate of homemade dog treats. "We made them just for you." Officer's eyes glistened as he watched the girl and dog interact. He'd seen this same dynamic before in other cases, but it never ceased to move him. These moments were why he'd transitioned from traditional police work to K9 therapy. These moments were where his life had found meaning. Over the following weeks and months, Sarah had become increasingly vocal about her daughter's recovery. She'd granted interviews to local journalists, sharing Emma's story with the wider community. What had begun as a local news story had gradually expanded into something more significant. Emma's case was featured in a regional psychology journal. Doctor had written about it. Mental health advocates had begun citing it as an example of innovative therapy approaches. Most significantly, Sarah had become an advocate for other families navigating similar crises. She'd started a support group for mothers dealing with domestic violence and custody battles. Every Tuesday evening, Sarah facilitated meetings in a community center where other women who had fled violent relationships, who were fighting for their children, who felt the system was stacked against them, gathered to share their stories and support one another. "I tell them about Emma," Sarah confided to Officer one afternoon as they watched Emma and Bailey play in the backyard. "I tell them that recovery is possible, that the system isn't always fair, but that sometimes, you find people like Judge Harrison who understand that love matters more than procedure, that connection matters more than protocol." Judge Harrison, meanwhile, had become an unlikely champion for expanding the K-9 comfort program throughout the state. He'd begun speaking at judicial conferences about the transformative power of animal-assisted therapy in family court proceedings. His professional reputation, previously built on legal scholarship and judicial restraint, had evolved to include advocacy for innovative approaches to trauma recovery. The judge had also made a point of attending Emma's school events. He'd attended her school assembly where she'd read a poem about her journey. He'd shown up at her recital where she'd performed a dance with her classmates. Judge Harrison, who had spent 30 years behind the bench, had discovered that his most important work now involved witnessing and celebrating the recovery of children like Emma. Officer and the K-9 Comfort Program had experienced unprecedented expansion. The success of Emma's case had generated sufficient public interest and political support that 3 additional therapy dog teams had been hired. The program now served multiple counties and had a waiting list of families seeking their services. Emma herself had become something of a minor celebrity in the mental health community. A documentary filmmaker had approached Sarah about making a short film about Emma's journey. Sarah had initially hesitated, concerned about exploiting her daughter. But Emma, with the wisdom that sometimes resides in children, had expressed her desire to participate. "I want other kids to know that they can talk again," Emma had told her mother. "I want them to know that it's okay to be scared and quiet for a while, and I want them to know about Bailey. Maybe if other kids know about Bailey, they can find their own Bailey and feel safe again." The documentary, titled 2 Words, premiered at a film festival to standing ovations. It told Emma's story with sensitivity and power, highlighting not just the trauma and breakthrough, but the ongoing work of healing, the difficult days alongside the victories, the nightmares that still sometimes came, the courage it took to speak and trust again after being so profoundly hurt. 1 year after that first meeting in Judge Harrison's chambers, Emma stood before a room full of graduate students in psychology at the local university. She was 7 years old now, confident and articulate, no longer the silent, hollow-eyed child who had seemed locked inside herself. She shared her story with remarkable clarity for her age, answering questions about what had helped her heal, what had scared her, what had given her courage. When asked what she wanted people to understand about trauma, Emma had responded with a wisdom that made grown adults weep. Trauma doesn't last forever, and it's not your fault, and there are people who want to help you, and sometimes help comes from a dog who loves you when you can't love yourself, and sometimes it comes from your mom who never stops fighting for you, and sometimes it comes from a judge who is brave enough to let his heart matter more than rules. Sarah sat in the back of the auditorium, watching her daughter speak, and she thought about that terrible night 3 years ago. She thought about David's rage, about the moment they'd been torn apart, about the 3 years of fighting through a system that had questioned her ability to heal her own child. But Emma's final words that day at the university captured the miracle perfectly. "Everyone thought I would never talk again. Everyone thought I was too broken to fix. But Bailey and my mom and Mrs. and Officer and Judge Harrison, they all believed that I could get better. And when people believe in you, even when you can't believe in yourself, you can do amazing things. You can find your voice. You can go home. You can be happy again." The room erupted in applause, and Emma smiled. A genuine, unself-conscious smile that proved that miracles were real, that healing was possible, and that sometimes it took the unconditional love of a dog and the unwavering determination of a mother to remind the world what true justice looked like.